It is Tuesday, March 15th, 2022. Hey everybody, it is Tuesday, March 15th, 2022. This is Cowboy Metal Live on goldsilverpros.com. I'm your host, Robert Keents. We broadcast from the great state of Texas, and we take no BS. Welcome everybody into the live stream. You guys know the drill. Put your questions down in chat. If you really want to get my attention, throw a super chat up there and I'll be happy to answer your question in detail. Today we're going to be talking about Russia, Ukraine, and the Great Reset Explained. We'll get into the details of that. I'm not going to have a lot of exhibits to put on screen. It's just going to be me talking to you guys and telling you what I see in the big bad world. Hey Sarge, how you doing? Thanks for joining the chat. Ralph Potts is here. Smart Alec. He says, hey Rob, was talking to 𝙎𝙊𝙇𝙍𝙀𝙍 yesterday, brilliant guy. I agree with you. That's why he's one of my good friends. And of course, he runs 𝙎𝙀𝙀𝙀𝙀, and we like to bring you the cheapest silver available. So go to goldsilverpros.com, click on precious metals deals, fill out the form for 𝙎𝙀𝙀𝙀𝙀, and Ian will, or one of his team will reach out to you. Dude Boy is here. Neil Hahn is here as usual. John Bethea is in the chat. We have a lot of people in the chat. We have a poll up today, ladies and gentlemen. And it is, do you believe the Great Reset is happening now? It's yes, no, it's too early, or it's already over. Yes is leading with 82% of the vote. The next is no, with 9% do not believe the Great Reset is happening now. We'll continue to follow that as we go further into the program. So far, 35 votes. Most of you have voted. That's good. Please vote in that poll when you enter. Jeff702 is here. He says, I love the shiny stuff. We do too, Jeff. That's why we have Gold Silver Pros channel. Dude Boy is here. Thank you everybody for joining. Today I've got a pretty serious topic. I'm not going to speak too specifically on the precious metals, although that will be a part of the presentation. Really today is to talk about the Great Reset. And those of you that have been following the channel know that I've been talking about the Great Reset for quite some time. I first talked about the monetary part of the Great Reset back. I want to say I wrote articles back in April 2019 on the old website. I've written about it in public on Seeking Alpha. We've put the pieces together, including gold, Basel III, oil, different alignment of trade and commodities. I spoke at a Money, Metals, and Mines Summit about a year and a half ago, where I talked about the coming commodity wars. That was at an online virtual conference. And I've talked about a lot of pieces of this along the way. Last year I talked about the Great Reset specifically, probably 2 or 3 videos, but I hadn't really covered it in a while. And the reason is because I just had my ear to the ground and I was watching what was going on, and I wanted to make sure that I understood sort of all the moving parts and kind of got an idea of what's going on. And I think with the Russian incursion into Ukraine and some of the things, of course, that come out with Ukraine and the other stuff we already know, I think I have a pretty good theory on where we are with the Great Reset and the various players. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So before I get started, everybody vote in the poll. Everybody leave a comment. Super chats are open. And again, this is just going to be me talking to you guys and letting you know what I think. So why Russia? Why Ukraine? And how is that related to the Great Reset? Well, the Great Reset is in financial terms, and actually let me put a little graphic up on the screen before we go any further. I'm only going to share a screen for a moment. Just for one moment, I'm going to show you the World Economic Forum, the Great Reset. So just to show you, this is something, it's not something that we're making up. This is something that World Economic Forum has talked about, various international groups have talked about. Urgent need for global stakeholders to cooperate in simultaneously managing the direct consequences of the COVID-19 crisis to improve the state of the world. The World Economic Forum is starting the Great Reset Initiative. Now they're saying COVID-19 here. I think the Great Reset has a lot more to do than that. It's just not only, in reaction to COVID-19. I think it's a lot of other stuff. But that's what we're talking about when we say the Great Reset. There's an economic part of it. There's a commodity part of it. There's a geopolitical part of it. And we're going to get into all the details on this program. So essentially what we're seeing is, as my great friend Steve Penny of the Silver Chart said last time he was on, there are basically financial wars, commodity wars, and then hot wars or physical wars. And I think we're in a stage of where all of that is ramping up. We are at the end of the debt-based fiat system. The Bretton Woods system that started after World War II went into high gear in 1971 after Nixon, as president, issued an executive order to take us off the gold standard. You know, the 1960s, we took silver out of the money. Then we became a pure fiat system. We're at the end of that system. I think that the traditional paper currencies are going away. The BIS and IMF have talked about, and I think it's now 60 or 70 central banks are in league with them, the idea of central bank digital currencies. So using blockchain or similar technology to issue state-issued digital currencies like the digital yuan, the digital euro, the digital pound, the digital dollar, so on and so forth. That is part of the Great Reset because they know it's the end of this current, you know, the Bretton Woods system and the pure dollar, petrodollar system. We'll talk about the petrodollar today as well. And however, when I say it's the end of that system, there are different players in the world. Think of it as different organizations in the world that aren't necessarily tied to a specific nation state. And that's the thing I really want to talk about today. It's not Russia versus Ukraine or the US versus Russia. It's a conglomeration of countries, corporate structures, intranational geopolitical entities that are aligning around different things in the world. And there is a realignment. It's not exactly like, say, the Axis and allies in previous world wars or previous geopolitical alignments. This has changed quite a bit. We see today news that Saudi Arabia is thinking about doing yuan-based oil trade, meaning it's basically the death of the petrodollar system for what was a major U.S. ally. And what that essentially means, and we've been calling this for a couple of 3 years now, that it's the end of the petrodollar system. You've had different countries trading oil outside the U.S. dollar, but Saudi Arabia was a big one. They're part of the big Middle Eastern, you know, oil cartel, if you will. And the U.S. had them exchanging, you know, dollars for oil and taking on our treasuries to support the U.S. dollar. And it spread the U.S. dollar over the world. It made it the predominant currency. As Saudi Arabia joins Russia and China in getting rid of trading oil for dollars, it basically is the end of the petrodollar system. We're here right now. So if you look at the poll that I have up, when I'm asking, do you believe the Great Reset is happening now? Part of that is the end of the petrodollar. And it's both an economic and a geopolitical realignment of the world. Getting outside of that old, the last vestiges of that Bretton Woods system that occurred after World War II. And that's really the stage that we're in. It's no longer the dollar is going to be the dominant currency. Now, in name it still is, but in reality it's not. Well, what does that have to do with Russia and Ukraine? There are a lot of moving pieces here. I believe, and I've said this many times on the show, I think it's Russia, China, and some other nations against the great Western powers. I do not believe that the United States has political autonomy anymore. I think through NATO, the United Nations, other trade agreements, you know, what was a NAFTA and is now a new agreement for North America, and what used to be the TPP, which is now called something else for the rest of the world. Those trade agreements basically have superseded the U.S. Constitution and individual U.S. sovereignty in the world, along with the other organizations that I talked about. And if you'll notice, for the first time, it looks like the sanctions are actually against Russia are actually working very well. Why is that? For the first time, you see almost a complete and utter alignment of all the Western nations together in sanctioning Russia. And you see the corporates doing it. You see companies like Apple doing it and other companies doing it, where they're Western companies, the corporates are aligning against Russia. And it's really having the most effect probably of any collection of sanctions in the history of, I mean, in the United States history at least, that I can ever remember. And it's because everybody's in lockstep. Well, what does that tell you? It tells you it's not just Biden and the administration or the U.S. administration. It's all these countries together. They're in lockstep against, you know, Russia because of their incursion. Well, is it just the incursion into Ukraine? Well, there's a lot of moving pieces here. I mentioned the petrodollar and the end of the dollar system. And I think everybody's aligning for when that fiat system dies. And there are a lot of moving pieces. I'll get to Russia and Ukraine in a minute. want to give more background. So the background with China specifically is the Belt and Road Initiative, connecting 73 to 75% of the world's GDP together in massive trade routes, which Russia is a part of, Brazil is a part of, countries in Africa are a part of, most of the world's a part of. And what they're doing is not only building trade routes, but it allows commodities to free flow. It's that war for commodities, or that war for resources. As we begin to see resources become more scarce and harder to get to and more expensive, the world has the international powers have begun aligning around trading those commodities and securing those commodities through these types of deals. It brings China to the forefront because a lot of this trade, this Belt and Road trade network is built using Chinese-based debt. So China is now becoming the default or the de facto debt-based world currency. And it will be because they're connecting more countries together than the US, who has a dying petrodollar. So the Chinese yuan probably is going to emerge as a leading global currency in a few years. This will take some time to play out. At least it will be a major competitor to the US dollar, and I think it'll supplant the US dollar. Of course, you might have the Russian currency in there, you might have a bunch of other currencies in there, but China will probably be the lead dog in this sled race. And then on the other side, you have the Blue Dot Network, which is basically Australia, Japan, the US, and some other nations, but it's not nearly as powerful as the Belt and Road Initiative. But we have this alignment across trade routes, but we also have this alignment across commodities and resources. That's what all of this is about. The commodity war has already begun. And the information war has been going for 20 plus years in cybersecurity with all the attacks and information and intelligence and in IP, intellectual property. And this is what allows China now to compete on the open market, some of these other countries to compete on the open market with technology. It allowed them to accelerate their industrial revolution and the change from industrial revolution to information age, which allows them to become a power. And then you had the gradual eastward expansion of NATO, got closer and closer to Russia. Russia's a big player. Russia has about 20% net of all the world's reserves of stuff. They're not necessarily leaders in everything, but a lot of oil, natural gas, platinum, palladium, tin, nickel, a lot of that kind of stuff comes from Russia. So Russia's a big player. They're certainly not the most economically stable, but they're a big player in world commodities markets. And they saw the encroachment, I think, of NATO and the missiles and all of that towards their borders. And not justifying any war. I never justify war. I'm just telling you what I see. I think Russia invaded Ukraine for a couple of reasons. One was because of the missile issue and the NATO issue and the potential for Ukraine being brought into the Western alliance of nations. And it hadn't happened, and NATO says it wasn't really on the docket immediately, but apparently there was a lot of jawboning, a lot of international politicking around adding Ukraine, a lot of it from the West, and I think Russia saw that and said, well, strike while the iron's hot. The second reason I think they did it is because Ukraine is part of the breadbasket in Europe of feeding, especially wheat, but it has a lot of Western GMO agriculture, and I don't think Russia necessarily wanted GMO agriculture. I think they wanted a more natural agriculture that wasn't controlled by the Western corporations, which own all the patents to all that stuff and really control most of the world's produce. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And I think that was a reason as well. And if you look at Ukraine, not only is it the breadbasket, it has massive resources of a lot of commodities. And it's a vast area. So it's something that Russia and the two eastern provinces, back to the times of Lenin, when a lot of Russians were moved in and Ukrainians moved out, those two independent areas of eastern Ukraine were really considered an extension of Russia. A lot of the people spoke Russian, have Russian background. But I think Russia also knows that it has to get to the capital, Kyiv, to control its own destiny in Ukraine and to put a buffer between it and the West. And I also think that while China is not formally supporting Russia in this, they realize also that if Russia goes down and the West somehow, whether through monetary incursion through central banking or military means or whatever, moves further east, that eventually it could threaten China as well. So I do think China's an ally to Russia, but they're playing the political game really well. And they're not condemning Russia, but they're not also supporting Russia. They're just letting Russia take that fight to the Western powers. I do think as the dollar system dies and the fiat paper currency system dies, it's going to be who has value. Basel III, part of that was re-engaging gold explicitly into the banking system, because gold is going to support the new digital currencies. And they don't want the people to have the gold, it's just going to support the banking system. And they're going to give us the digital currencies. It's going to be a derivative of gold. We're not going to get gold, or we're not going to get central bank stocks and other things that are high quality liquid assets. But we're going to get a derivative of that, which is a central bank digital currency. But the central banks want the gold. That's why they've been buying it since 2010, since the last crisis. And so they know that system is coming. So, but you have to have resources to back it up. Gold will be a monetary resource. Silver is a monetary resource, but it's more used industrially. But you've got other things. You've got food security. You've got base metals. You've got rare earths, which China is very strongly positioned, not only in mining them, but also developing that market and producing the end rare earth product that everybody needs. There's a lot of other things going on there with alignment of resources. And it has been said many times, not only by 𝙎𝙄𝙇𝘿, who was a Mexican billionaire, but a lot of other people, that Russia and China have threatened to back their new digital currencies, which I believe will be the digital versions, with gold, and to recapitalize their banking system and challenge the West. Now, the West, I think, threatened by that, was one reason they wanted to move NATO east and put, weapons on Russia's border to threaten Russia, because Russia had thrown out a lot of the Western banking elites out of Russia. So they weren't able to get the central banking system into Russia, at least owned by the Western elites. Russia has its own, version of central banking. So they weren't able to do it through central banking, so they were going to do it through geopolitical means, through sanctions, economic means, and through the military. And I think that's why Russia went in. Russia is fighting in its eyes, and again, I'm not justifying this, it's just what I see. In its eyes, it's fighting the West, aligning under this almost supranational state in which none of the participating countries have their own true sovereignty. They all answer to a higher collective power. And it probably is the moneyed interests and the corporate interests, really, to be honest with you. Special interests, as one of my friends calls it. They saw that happening, and they were like, this is last chance for us to secure Ukraine, its resources, stop the incursion of the West on Russia's border. There are also a lot of articles come out about chemical and viral labs in Ukraine run by the West, and Russia may have wanted to go in there and get rid of those, or at least take control of those, keep the West from putting massive chemical production on its borders. So another military reason. I think that's a lot of what's happening. And I think what we're seeing is we're right in the middle of the Great Reset. The Great Reset's been happening for years. It's not only monetary, it's geopolitical, it's commodity based. This is what all wars are eventually fought over. It's not only land, but it's resources and power and influence. And that's what's going on. And Russia-Ukraine really isn't even the first step. You have to look back at the Arab Spring and years ago, and those nations in the Middle East standing up to Western powers that were over there. You have to look at Syria. You have to look at Taiwan and China and that relationship, Hong Kong and China and that relationship, to really understand this battle's already been happening on many fronts. It's not an outright worldwide war, but there are a lot of things going on economically, from a cyber perspective, geopolitically, before Russia-Ukraine ever happened. Russia-Ukraine is another step down the road. I fully suspect that when the financial system collapses, the current last vestiges of Bretton Woods, the pure fiat debt-based system collapses, everybody needs to have their ducks in a row in terms of their commodities and their resources. And it may be that we're only months or weeks away from Russia and China saying we're backing our currencies of gold, or we're bringing gold back into the monetary system, forcing the West to divulge how much gold they actually have. Do they actually have it? Does the U.S. actually have all that gold at Fort Knox and wherever else they're keeping it, 8,100 and something tons? No, there hadn't been an audit in 70 years. Maybe China and Russia are at about the point where they announced they're utilizing gold in the financial system to support the currencies and forces the West's hands. And that could cause a massive collapse against the West. And I think this is all going on behind the scenes right now. And I think there's going to be more stuff coming. There's going to be more war coming. Just because you look at when you have a great financial collapse and reset like this throughout history, anytime there have been major economic problems, we've gone to war. And we have financial problems due to the financial markets, but also the resource wars. And I think all that's coming to a head at one time. And if you look at long-term nation-state cycles and economic cycles, we're at a point at which historically the U.S. had taken a backseat to a rising economic power. We're going to have a changeover in the monetary system, but we're also going to have a war now that the world has reached a certain population, and we've all been using more resources than we need to thanks to this pure fiat monetary system. You know, if we were constrained by gold, none of us would have use as many resources every day as we do, and we wouldn't waste as much. But because of the fiat system, we've used a lot of our resources. So now the world has to take a step back in terms of its overall level of stuff that it uses. And I'm talking food, I'm talking metals, I'm talking all this stuff. All this stuff goes into it. So there has to be a reset for that reason as well. I do believe that employment is going to fall across the world. I do think that it's going to be harder to support the current amount of people in the world as well. So there's going to be population reductions through people not having as many kids, you know, and people getting older and dying and not being replaced by as many of the younger generation. I think there are also probably at some point going to come, in a lot of countries, restrictions on how many children you can have, because we're going to have a scarcity of resources. We're in a scarce resource environment, not only in gold and silver, but in a lot of things. And the world is coping with that. So what you're seeing geopolitically is an alignment around a capture of the resources and a capture of that geopolitical power to support what many see is going to be a winter. And the winter is going to be multifaceted. It's not just a financial winter, it's a winter of availability of things that we need to survive. That's been very clear. And you pair that with the lack of investment into the left end of the supply chain, the commodity sector. It's really making things worse even than it would have been otherwise. So that's the Great Reset. And it's going to take years to play out. I think it will take years to play out before the CBDCs, the central bank digital currencies, are fully ready, between when the economies finally collapse, between when all of the hot wars start around the world. I think it's going to be some time before that happens. But I think Russia and Ukraine is another step along that line. I think there are reasons why it's happening. I think it's China, Russia, and some of the BRIC nations against the Western powers for all the marbles. And when I say all the marbles, and I talked about this about a year ago when I was at Money, Metals, and Mines, I said the resource war is a war for all the marbles. You know, it's not just for land, it's not just for political power, it's for the ability to survive. And I think that's where we are. I think the good news is if you've saved in gold and silver, you're way ahead of the game, because you're going to have tremendous gains in pure fiat terms in your ability to maintain your purchasing power and survive. But I think you're going to need other things. You're going to need food, you're going to need water, you're going to need shelter, and all those things. And all of those things are going to be tougher to come by. For example, I live in an apartment now, and no longer live in a home, sold that off. But my apartment rent went up by 10%, you know, from last year to this year. I just got that notice. Everything's going up. Everything's becoming more expensive. That's inflation. But it's not only inflation due to monetary supply, it's the lack of resources available for the world. And that's what the world is fighting over. And that's why I've said before, I don't think Russia is going to stop at Ukraine. Now, I don't think they're going to have incursions into NATO countries anytime soon. I think what will precipitate that is more financial war, probably some cyber war, a financial collapse, a reset into digital currencies, things like that, and then more hot wars will start. But I don't think it ends at Ukraine. I think the U.S. and NATO nations eventually are going to get involved. China will get involved. Japan will be pulled in. That's why Japan is refunding the military. That's why Germany is spending over 2% of their GDP now on military. That's why the U.S. is selling F-35 planes as fast as it can to all of its allies. All that news has been coming out lately. I mean, the amount of news on the war buildup has been absolutely ridiculous. And what the West is trying to do is starve out Russia, sort of to take away their power in this structure with the sanctions, and starve Russia's ability to finance itself with oil. Now, Russia has legalized and turned to Bitcoin. Russia is still finding some trade partners for its resources, but it's getting harder. And who knows how long Russia can put up with this before it breaks. So I think Russia has to accelerate its incursions in Ukraine and get that taken over and get themselves established before the West starves it out through the sanctions and through the trade routes. And it's fortunate for Russia on Russia's side that they're part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So they're still able to sell some stuff. It's just harder. And so I think there's a race. I think there's a race for Russia to get Ukraine settled before the West starves it. Whether or not that will happen, I don't know. But at the end of the day, that's what's happening. So a lot of this, no longer are we living in this constitutional world where the U.S. stands on its own. We're all part of supranational agencies. The BIS, the IMF, NATO, UN, you name it. There are lots of these things. And it explains a lot. It explains a lot about the reaction, the worldwide reaction to Russia. And of course, we always want to condemn somebody for waging war on somebody else, but the way in which this has occurred has been much swifter and much more violent, because I think it's the West fighting for its central bank system and Russia, China, and the rest of the world fighting against it. And that's really what we're seeing. And it's the fight for resources for when the collapse comes, because the financial collapse is coming. That's not stoppable. In fact, I think it's happening now. There's an article that's out where 𝙎𝙄𝙇𝙀𝙍, which is a former Fed person, is talking about margin call doom loop. We're starting to see the CLOs start to collapse, the collateralized loan obligation market start to collapse. And that, along with collapses of commodities like the stoppage of the nickel market and other derivative markets, could cause a massive margin call doom loop around the world. How does that work? Well, once you get margin called, you have to go to your bank to be able to stop the margin call or pay for your debts in these derivative markets. Remember, leverage markets, you can take on a lot of potential risk in a leverage market. So the banks are running out of cash to support their clients who are getting margin called. And that is a run on available liquidity in the system, and that could cause margin calls to spiral out of control into what 𝙎𝙄𝙇𝙀 calls a doom loop. And that could be the financial black swan. We talked about Deutsche Bank. We talked about a banking failure. It may not be a specific bank. It may be the derivative markets that kick it off. They kick off the financial collapse. And we may be in it right now. We may be in the beginning of that financial collapse. And so I think it is a rush for these countries and this realignment, around both financial and commodity basis to occur. And I think that's why we saw Ukraine when we saw it. And that's sort of the tip of the spear, or the first part of it, if you will, but I think there's a lot more coming. I think there's a lot more coming. And this is just another aspect of the Great Reset. And going back to what my friend Steve said, Steve Penny, the Silver Chartist, said, you got your resource war, and then here comes the kinetic. And we're starting to see the kinetic. I don't think we'll go to massive world war anytime soon, meaning the next 6 months, but I do think as the financial collapse progresses and the rush into safety and in today's world, it's liquidity of derivatives that matters, but in the real world, when that collapses, it's going to be liquidity of real things. How do you build your economy? Do you have gold? Do you have your resources? Do you have trading partners? That's the next stage. And I think that's where we are. And so putting the pieces together, I think really that's kind of where we're at in the Great Reset at this moment. And I wanted to talk about it because I haven't talked about the Great Reset a whole lot. I've been focusing on the precious metals. It's kind of, the basis of what we do here, but it was worthwhile coming back to this because as I see the reaction to Russia and Ukraine and how everything's aligning, that last piece of the Great Reset starts to become clear. And we're going to see more. I don't think this is the end of it. And as I've been saying on this channel since I started doing these videos, you don't have a lot of time to prepare. And gold, silver definitely is what you want to prepare financially. Do the mining stocks for leverage, to get your little bit of speculative benefit in there, some money in there, but also other things now, food, water, shelter, safe jurisdiction, get out of debt, have a network of people that can help you secure your meds. I've started talking about this the last few months, and I think it's getting serious. I don't think we truly know the depth of the issues in the financial system, and I think it's going to become clear the next few years. It's starting to become clear. We've got gas over $4 a gallon solely in the U.S., highest rates ever for gas in the last couple of weeks. Oil has spiked, came down a little bit, but it spiked. And I think we're going to see massive inflation not only from printed dollars and printed yuan and printed euros, but a lack of available resources coming. It's going to be a double whammy. Much more currency raising the last few years, especially due to the pandemic and money printing, much lower levels of available commodities. And the trade networks are going to close off this big globalization to where the U.S. can't just go get its rare earths from China anymore. And we can't go get our wheat from the Ukraine anymore, or Russia can't get it, or the natural gas may not flow from Russia to Europe anymore. And if you add in the fact that the environmental concerns around shutting down reactors in Germany and shutting down nuclear, there are a lot of problems coming to the world that haven't been realized yet. There's going to be a shortage of a lot of things. Energy is going to be one of those. So that, I think, is where we are in the Great Reset. That's my explanation of it, and including Russia, Ukraine. I've been talking for about 30 minutes now. I'm going to take a little bit of a break, go back to the chat and see where you guys are at. I do not see any super chats, so I'll look through here and see what we may have with regard to questions in the chat. Beverly Smith says, is this a repeat of Weimar Republic 1922? Yes, Beverly, but on a worldwide level, because this is the end of the entire fiat monetary system across the world, not just for Germany. It's hyperinflation across the world. John Bethea says, Russia and China have more friends than the USA does. I think from a trading perspective, they're right. He's right. I don't see a whole lot. Jay Greener says, hola, Rob, get your preps in order. That's right. Get your preps in order. Whatever level of preparation you need, I'll let you define that for yourself, but definitely get them in order. I don't see any other questions there. If you have them, throw them down there. Steve Ross Holmes says, the central banks will not want us to have gold. Will they make it illegal? Will they confiscate it? If so, how do we hold it and use it to avoid CBDCs? So I've said for years, I didn't think that they would go mass confiscate gold out of the mines. I think they need the private industry to run them. Although, instead of confiscating it, they could contract to buy it all at a discount or I don't think they'll nationalize, but I think that they could put certain things in place that force the miners to produce metal more directly to the governments and to industry and control it in a lot of ways. I am beginning to think that there are certain storages of gold and silver and other resources that could be nationalized. So you have to be careful where you store your stuff. I think that could happen. But I think now if you want your gold and silver free and clear and you don't want it confiscated to where you can't get it, you got to go get it now, like right now. Go to arcsilver.com or go to goldsilverpros.com and click on precious metals and get it from either arcsilver.com or get it from Miles Franklin. Go get your gold and silver now. You get better deals through our website and everybody else. I have those deals arranged, if you want to get it, because I don't know in a year or 2 years if it's going to be as plentiful. Good day from Sydney, Australia. Hello, Carlos Lamprea. Nice to meet you, and thank you for joining the chat. Douglas James says, as I understand it, gold coins issued pre-1933 are collectible grade. Bit more premium, exempted from 1932 Act of Confiscation. Yeah, what basically, to translate that, it means anything pre-1933 are considered collectible, so they have numismatic value. More than likely, those won't be confiscated. There aren't many, and it benefits people with a lot of money, the elites per se, financial elites in society. So probably won't confiscate those. It'll be used to store value, much like artwork, I think. Victor T says, Rob, hey Victor T, how you doing? A shout out for you. Does China go after Taiwan, says Cowtown. Yes, I do. I think they're already going after Taiwan. There was an article yesterday that there were 4 jets that had completely breached Taiwan airspace. Like we're in Taiwan airspace, Chinese jets. I don't think there's any question they're going after Taiwan. No question. Now, is it an outright hot war? How long do they wait? What else has to precipitate that before China does it? I don't know, to be honest with you, but I think, yes, they want Taiwan, obviously. Rolf Steiner says, they want Putin taken out. Color revolution in Russia, like Canada, where they install Justin Trudeau and then steal Russia's oil and resources like the U.S. empire have done worldwide. That's a good point. I do think that they want to get into Russia. I think the Western central bank elites have not been able to get in to Russia as much as they've been other countries, so they're using other methods, political methods, military methods. I do agree with you, and Russia does have a ton of world resources. But I also think that they want to weaken one of the last truly independent nations. Russia is one of those. China's another. They want to absorb it into the Western system. It's a war for all the marbles. It's powers around the world wanting to consolidate even more power, I believe. Beverly Smith says, will the yuan increase in value as a consequence of that conflict, operation, invasion? Yeah, I think the paper version yuan will come under pressure, but the CBDC will increase because China can back it by gold. More gold, more than likely than the U.S. has, a lot more. Wendell, thank you for the contribution. De-dollarization force, return to gold standard. No, not outright return to gold standard. I believe, based on reading Basel III, I'm convinced that gold will be a high-quality liquid asset that will support the commercial and central banking system. But it will not be the only high-quality liquid asset. They're going to use bank stocks, and they're going to use cash. That's what's defined in Basel III, and some other things. Silver could be, although I think it's very industrialized. I think that whoever has a higher percentage of those high-quality liquid assets will have the more stable banking system. But I don't think they're going specifically to gold standard where you can trade gold for CBDC or paper dollars. They're not ever going back to that. And they don't want citizens to own a lot of gold. It offers them independence. They don't want independence. They want control through central bank digital currency. And they want to control aggregate money flow. You can't do that if you're allowing gold and silver to trade side by side as money. So traditional gold standard, as we've seen previously in the world, no. I don't believe so. Not in my humble opinion. Looks like the sound is still doing good. I'm doing a sound check on the channel. Looks good. If you have any other questions, let me know. We've had a lot of stuff coming on Twitter and to the channel the last couple of weeks. We're going to add more content, guys. We've got a lot of content coming up. Remember to go to goldsilverpros.com. Sign up for the free newsletter. You get it every Monday. Also, click on the Precious Metals Deals link if you want to get your metals. Arc Silver has silver deals you're not going to get anywhere else. You get silver cheaper than anywhere on the internet. Well, Andy at Miles Franklin to get you just about whatever you want, gold or silver. Nick Collishaw says, Ukraine was just another resource grab by the West that helped fund the coup in 2014 thanks to support from Obama and billions from Soros. The current instability was spawned from this manipulation. That could be true. That's Nick's comment. Good comment there, Nick. All right, that is my view. We got 242 in the live chat, guys. I'll just summarize what I've stated. Russia's incursion into Ukraine happened for several reasons. It was to break the GMO monopoly on wheat there in Ukraine. It was to capitalize on all the resources Ukraine has, and it was to put a buffer between the encroaching NATO into Eastern Europe and Russia. I think those are the main reasons. I'm not justifying, just saying I think that's why it was done. Never justify war, but that's why it's done. I don't think Russia's going to go invade NATO countries soon, but I have said that if they do, Poland's on that list. A lot of them are on the list. It could happen. I think other things have to happen before that happens. The big financial crash more than likely before we go into a broader war, but it could happen. It's not out of the realm of possibility. We talked about the economic sanctions and how the Western world's aligned, acting as one unit, not as independent sovereign nations like Germany, separate from Spain, separate from the U.S., separate from Canada. They're all acting in line. I think we've lost our national sovereignty here in the U.S. in all but name. And I think it's the Western powers versus China, Russia, and the rest of the BRIC nations for all of the marbles. All right, guys, I think this may do it for today. This is probably one of the absolute most important live streams I've done in a long time. I realize I haven't talked about the Great Reset in a while, but I think a lot has come more clear over time, especially Russia and Ukraine, and the way that the world reacted to that has told us a lot about how far we are into the Great Reset. It's not just economic, it's geopolitical and commodities based. It also has to do with culture. There's a lot of cultural aspects there as well. And I do think it's a coming war for all the marbles. I do think we're going into another world war of sorts. I think we're already there from a cyber perspective. You've got chemical, you've got EMP, you've got kinetic, and you've got economic that are all, I believe, ramping up at different stages. We're going to see it all this time. And yes, the crack up boom, Jeff 702 says a crack up boom. There will be one more boom in the U.S. markets before it collapses. I don't know exactly when that's going to happen, but it's going to be the last, thrust of liquidity by the central bank to stave off collapse. I do think tomorrow the Fed's going to announce whether they're doing rate hikes. There is a poll on Twitter. I'll talk about that poll real quick. There's a poll on Twitter I put up that says, tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, the Fed announces whether they hike the Fed funds rate. And I said, what do you think they'll hike it to? 16.7% said 0.5%. 53.1% answered 0.25%. 14.6% answered no hike. And 15.6% took the comedic option in the poll, which is Powell will come out dressed as a clown, which is entirely possible. So tomorrow we'll find out if the Fed is hiking rates. If they hike rates and they continue down that path, it will cause a collapse of the stock market, which will cause the last rush of money into the system by the Fed, which will be the crack up boom. I think that's what's going to happen. And we're going to see that happen within the next year to year and a half at the most. And then we'll get more into the kinetic wars. I think those will happen as well. Thank you to Steve Ross Holmes and Wendell for the super chats. I appreciate the support. We're going to end up the poll. The poll is, do you believe the Great Reset is happening now? Great Reset. 77% say yes, 9% no, 10% it's too early, 3% already over. I believe it's happening right now is the right answer. I think it takes years and years and years, maybe over a decade for this to occur, maybe 2 decades. We're right in that middle stage. Things are starting to heat up, but I think more is coming. It's going to come faster, and it's going to become more turbulent. I think the markets will become more turbulent. I think you'll see precious metals prices bounce around much higher than they have. We popped up about the 2050 ranges within the last week, and now we're back down into the mid to low 1900s. Right now, gold's at 1917. You're seeing a lot more volatility in gold price a lot more quickly than we're traditionally see. You're going to see it in the other markets. Also comment today on Pozar, put it on Twitter and talked about it here, about a margin call doom loop. And I was just, it's funny that news came out today because I was watching the movie Margin Call. I think it came out in 2011 on, what was it, Amazon Prime last night, I believe it was, and got about halfway in the movie before I turned it off. But they were talking about the margin call in the mortgage markets that happened in 2008, 2009. What Pozar now is talking about is a margin call doom loop around all derivatives markets. And that could end up being the big black swan that takes down these debt-based fiat financial markets. We'll have to see. Good information. We'll see what happens. This has been the live Tuesday, March 15, 2022, Cowboy Metal Livestream. We broadcast from the great state of Texas, and we take no bullshit. And we talked about Russia, Ukraine, and expanded upon our theory about the Great Reset. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Lots of people joined the chat. Appreciate everybody here that supports the channel. I got up to about 250 simultaneously on this one. This is a really good one, guys. Thursday, we'll have more content for you. I believe Andy comes back to the program from Miles Franklin, and we'll have additional content as well. A reminder, on April 27th, we'll have a next virtual conference. I'll announce that, and I've got a really big announcement coming out in the next 2 weeks. We're expanding coverage, ladies and gentlemen, beyond gold and silver and to many more of the financial markets. We'll talk about that soon. Stay tuned to the channel. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We appreciate you. We'll be back. This has been Rob Keats of GoldSilverPros.com.